Started in just a couple of minutes as more people trickle in. The good news is, since we've only had one class canceled, our first meeting, we're still pretty on track at this point in the quarter, so it should be going okay. I'm teaching a class this afternoon that is having its very first class meeting today, so they're in a little bit more challenging in this one. Fun to adjust to all of this. I kind of arrogantly thought, having lived in Salt Lake City for 5 years, where we get a lot of the kind of big powdery snow, that I was prepared, but a lot of snow and roads that are not in the best of conditions, so it's been kind of fun. Like we've got Travis, who's joining us through Zoom. Again, I'll have the class recording uploaded right after class, and then basically that recording is also the Zoom meeting. So Travis will be able to participate with us and see what's going on through Zoom, since I've got the slides shared up there. Okay, so I have us at 11, so let's go ahead and get started for today. So welcome back. This is our second class meeting for COM 330. Are you listening? I imagine there are a couple folks that are here for the first time today, so we'll do kind of a quick introduction of new folks in the class in just a little bit. I also want to use today's class as a way of diving into more of the specifics about the course. So understanding different styles of listening, what it means to be a good listener, and so on, are some of the things that we'll be getting into for today to build off of our discussion last class. We had a fun kind of game of telephone in the last class where people were telling Willie's story over and over again, and it helped us to understand, what sticks with us as we're listening to a message, what gets lost over the course of conversation, and what we use as strategies to try to remember information for later. So to get us started for today, I'm going to share an idea, concept, and I'll be giving you a prompt where you'll be thinking about this concept a little bit on your own. And that is 4 different major types of listeners. So there's 4 types of listeners that we've generally come to know over the course of the past several decades of research. And we can find that people generally fall in one of these 4 different categories: people-oriented listeners, action-oriented listeners, content-oriented listeners, and time-oriented listeners. And there's a lot of different things that can impact the kind of listener that you are, including things like culture, right? How you were grown up, where you were raised, gender, right? Gender, including roles and stereotypes and so on, can impact that as well. The jobs and experiences you've had over the course of your life, and so on. So people-oriented listeners are folks that are really concerned with getting to know and understanding other people, right? So maybe you have a friend that's really social and texts you all the time and really likes to meet with you, right? It's not so much that there's a specific thing to talk about or topic, it's that this person just is a people person who likes getting to know and understanding other people. In fact, people-oriented listeners are often folks that will get lost in just getting to know somebody. They're more likely to be off topic or off track just because they're so interested in that other person and getting to know them that they lose focus on the topic. In a group, people-oriented listeners might be considered to be socializing all the time or off topic, but other people are just the things that really stand out to them as interesting. Secondarily, we have action-oriented listeners, right? When we have a conversation with somebody, one thing that can oftentimes be a source of disagreement and challenge, including in intimate partner relationships, is when one person wants to vent and share the challenges they're going through, and the other person says, well, what do you want me to do about it, right? And wants a solutions-based approach, when the person you're talking to does not always want that or doesn't always feel like that's the best option. So an action-oriented listener is that person who asks, what can I do? How can I address this issue? They're really interested in good and accurate information, right? They want to understand what's going on, and they want to focus on solving the problem. So for instance, right, if you called up a plumber and you were to say, there's something going wrong in my dorm, the sink and the pipes aren't working, or you contact, right, like resident services, the person you're going to talk to on the phone says, what's the problem? What's going on? Right? They're going to develop a specific strategy for addressing it. That's an action-oriented listener who really wants to focus on what to do. Third, we have content-oriented listeners, right? So content-oriented listeners are folks that are really interested and think of conversations almost like a puzzle, right? There's that meme that has like that older middle-aged woman who's like thinking, and there's these like complex math equations going on in the background. It's kind of like that, right? It's the idea that you're interested in solving like a complex mathematical problem, or in a regular conversation, right? You're interested in the topic. Maybe a guest speaker comes to campus, right? Or you see some type of lecture or topic, or you watch a video essay on YouTube. You are listening because you're interested in, how to cook eggs the best way possible, something like that, right? So content-oriented listeners really like understanding the message itself. They might get lost and not focus as much on the person who's delivering the message. They're not necessarily focused on a solution. Content-oriented listeners, in fact, can be frustrating because they can sometimes drag the group down or spend too long on something just because of how interested they are in what's going on. Lastly, we have time-oriented listeners. How many of you keep like an active calendar or planner? A couple of you. I definitely recommend it and keeping sort of a schedule of things going forward. Time-oriented listeners are folks that generally swear by this stuff, right? They might have a Google Calendar that says, I'm meeting with so-and-so at 11, I'm meeting with so-and-so at 2, right? So when they listen and they have a conversation, they're not as much focused on the content, although they might care about that, right? They are really concerned about containing things within a specific period of time, really focused on solving the issues in that period. Oftentimes, people that come from a position of leadership, right, like a supervisor or boss, are going to be time-oriented listeners. We only have so much time to address and solve this issue, and time can sometimes be used as a strategy for getting something to finish, right? We only have a half hour to solve this problem. Let's work together on it. And you might find diamonds under pressure. And by working under that short period of time, you figure out a solution to the problem. So these are 4 different ways that we tend to listen. And generally speaking, we can fall into one of those categories. You might think about how maybe you fit more into a couple different ones, but there might be one of the 4 strategies that's the most common and that you're the most likely to use. So what I'd like you to do is to take some time on your own, and I'm not going to be asking you to turn this in. Normally, in a lot of classes, I'll do things like individual prompts or group prompts where you can write or type something and turn it in for attendance. Not doing that today, since I'm not going to take formal attendance until next week because of all the surveys and everything else that's been happening. But I would like you to take some notes for yourself, since we'll be sharing with the group. Which of these four kinds of listeners are you? What best describes you? Maybe I was talking through the four, there was one that resonated with you more than the others. You might also, in a sentence or two, explain why you feel like you're one of these four. So I'll give you a couple minutes to work on this, and then I'll ask us to go around and share which type of listener best resonates with you. Take another minute or so to finish up. So we've got some participation on Zoom here, right? Got somebody talking about how they're very much a time-oriented listener who really likes to be focused on limitation, constraints, and so on. I think that's a good approach and way of thinking about that. Thanks so much for sharing. So let's go around for folks that are here face-to-face and remind us your name. And then if you're here for the first time today, I'd like you to do a short introduction. So at last time, I asked folks to explain where home is for you. And one interesting or uninteresting flight cancellation thing happened to you during your winter break. And then I'm asking everybody to share what type of listener they identified as and why they felt that. So let's go ahead and start here in the front on this side.
My name is Macy, and I think that I am more often a time-oriented listener. I have like multiple planners and calendars, and I feel that I'm always trying to like block out time during my day, and that includes like socializing and stuff. And it just helps me feel more organized. So
yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I'm Nicole. Today is my first day of class here. I also said I am a time-oriented listener as well. Same thing as basically a lot of commitments between job and school and everything.
So where is home for you?
I'm from Tacoma, Washington. That is my home on the west side of Washington.
Great.
Something interesting in my opinion. I don't know if you guys saw, like, Seattle got snow, and it was like how people go
Yes.
snowboarding downtown is true. I was cross-country skiing down Pacific Ave, and then my parents saw me on Matthews in the background.
That's great. So I have family just south of Seattle in the Kent area. And I went up to see them for the holidays and definitely saw the snow as well. So
Oh,
that's a
yeah.
lot of fun.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, and very clearly not a place that's used to getting a lot of
Oh,
snow.
no, it's people lose their minds. It's so cool.
Yeah. Well, it's great to have you here, Nicole. Thanks for introducing yourself to the group.
Hi, I'm Crew. I said I'm a people-oriented listener.
Yeah.
Because I won't really be into the conversation or the lecture personally if I don't feel like I'm on a more personal level with
Sure.
whoever's talking, and I also like how conversations naturally could go on tangents and go crazy places when you're just listening and talking to people about things other than the content.
Yeah, yeah. It's nice to have the openness to feel like a conversation can go a lot of different ways. Appreciate you sharing for sure.
My name's Destiny.
Welcome
and,
back.
Oh, we're good. So I'm a people-oriented listener. I like to focus on the way a person feels, and I like to try and empathize with them.
Uh-huh.
And I think I'm definitely not an action-oriented listener, because people do that to me, and I just want to vent. It like irritates me.
Yeah.
When they try to come up with a solution, and I'm just like, no, I want to talk.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's challenging too when people come from different places to develop this like shared understanding. One thing that can save relationships, right, is starting out by saying, all right, you want me to listen? You want me to come up with solutions, right? And that can be a really good way to just make sure that somebody's feeling like they're being heard, right? In a lot of situations like that. For sure. Presley?
I'm Presley, and the kind of listener I am is probably people oriented.
Mhm.
I like to build connections with people, and usually I'm not the one to be like, I don't know, speak up.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like
yeah.
to build connections over just like listening, and even if it's over nothing.
yeah.
Passing
It's like,
information.
it can feel a lot more natural that way, right? You just click with somebody, you find somebody that's a good friend. You just have a lot to talk to, right? Your best friends are oftentimes people where you can just go on and on about whatever. There's not a lot of like rigid direction about what you talk about. Sure.
My name is Fatima, and mostly I'm a time and action person, especially because mostly I have 2 times when I'm doing camera, which is my job related.
Uh-huh.
I'm an RA, which I put time into that, it's also being a student. And
Yeah.
I mostly put times when I'm doing homework or at least go to check on my residents, and I mostly have to be a mediator.
Uh-huh.
She's gonna side of another person, but also try to solve problems if I can, or you go to 2, but it's 3 hours.
Yeah. Sorry, could you repeat your name one more time?
Fatima?
Fatima? Great, thank you. Yeah, being in that role where you have to be a mediator or have some level of leadership can definitely be something that makes the decision for you, right?
I'm Zach, and I said I'm probably more of an action-oriented listener because, well, especially this year, I live with one of my roommates and his girlfriend, and there's just like consistent arguing, and then they usually bring the other 2 roommates into it, and so I kind of usually the type of person that wants to hear both sides of the story before making assumptions.
Yeah, it can be good to like make a decision with good information, right? And getting in that action-oriented role, you want to have an accurate sense of what's going on. So thanks for sharing. Yeah.
My name is Willie, and I said that I was time oriented just because with football, school, and work, I just have to be on a pretty precise schedule. Every
Yeah.
day. I have every day planned out just how I'm gonna do it. We have this thing called AGP, which is academic game plan for football, and you have to fill it out with what you're doing every hour of the day all the way till bed.
Wow.
So usually it's pretty set to the point of what I'm gonna be doing and how I'm listening. So
Yeah, right. Sometimes like your schedule and the way that you have to map things out, like kind of makes the decision for you, right? I'd imagine you're constantly thinking about that. How you manage your time.
I'm Marisol or Marisol for anybody that's, or Maris, or what is it?
I'm Marisol or Mari for anybody who can't say that. This is my first day of this class. I'm from Riverside, California, which is SoCal. Interesting thing that happened. I got to see my grandma for the first time in like 2 years, so that was nice. I want to say I'm a people oriented listener, and I used to be for sure, but now with just sports and college and work and everything, I feel like I'm a time oriented person. I just like to get things done and move on to the next thing.
Sure. Welcome back. Thanks, Marisol. I really like your point here about how there's like the shift, right? As you're developing a schedule, going to college, doing all those things where you like have to map things out a little bit differently. I think that's a good observation there.
I'm Garrett. I also said I'm a time-oriented listener. Now, some of that obviously comes down to just the convenience of managing class and work and whatnot. Generally speaking, though, once I kind of process the initial instruction or message, my mind immediately goes to, okay, how long do we have? When does it need to get done? When do we start? That sort of thing.
Sure. I like that, the way you're describing like the shift, kind of once you've got the baseline, you shift more to a time focus. That's a interesting observation for sure.
I'm Trevor. I said I'm more of an action oriented just because I want to just get right working away on something. Because just deadlines and everything.
Yeah. Right. Sometimes you just have to, with that stuff coming up in the timeline.
I'm Malia, and then I said that I'm either a time or content oriented listener. For time, I work with up to like 4 clients a day in the job that I do, so I've had to learn how to like respectfully cut people off to get to the next place, I guess. And then for content, when I'm like venting to friends or they're venting to me, we always really like to have long conversations talking about several different viewpoints and such or feelings.
Yeah. It's never fun to have to be the one to cut somebody off, but sometimes you just got to do it to keep things on track, and it helps pay off later. So I appreciate it. Yeah.
My name is Johnny, and I said I was a time-oriented person to the sport that I do, and then the other responsibilities that I have.
Yeah. Again, it's interesting to see folks talking about their schedule, sports, and all of that impacting things too. I'm curious, how many folks have found that maybe since coming to college or at some point in their lives that their listening style has changed fairly substantially? Yeah, so for a number of you. A lot more time-oriented listeners than I would have expected, but it does make sense, right? I would say I oftentimes wind up being a content-oriented listener. I really like diving into and figuring out things like a puzzle, but I've had them make a more time-oriented shift too, as we've had like meetings and schedules and figuring all of that stuff out. So thanks so much for sharing. And I think this is a great way to think about the ways that we listen differently, the goals, the things that we're looking in are listening, things that we're looking for in our listening, and so on, right? So I'm gonna flip this over and see if I can do this. All right. So Johnny, Malia, Garrett, Trevor, Willie, Marisol, Presley, Fatima, Jack, Macy, Nicole, Crew, Destiny. All right, cool. Got it. What's that?
It's Zach. It's
Oh,
actually Zach.
Oh,
You're good. No, you're good.
I have like a couple of Zachs and Jacks, so I get those mixed up. So sorry about that.
No,
Yes,
You're fine. You're fine.
almost. We'll try it again next week. So we talked a little bit about different types of listeners. So for this class, we'll be talking in addition to that about what listening is, right? To break down what that means. And then also talk about some of the different situations in which we listen. So we can be different types of listeners ourselves, but depending on the situation, right? We are going to have different goals and areas that we focus on within our listening team. Just for some housekeeping, including for folks that were here for the first time today, last class I uploaded the recording to Canvas. We went over the syllabus, we did some introductions and some basic stuff related to the class. I'll always post the video and slides, and I'll also post the slides shortly before the class started. to help you so that you don't need to directly like take notes on everything. So don't worry if you feel like you're falling behind. We have our first quiz. This is open note, open book, and taken on Canvas, due by the end of the day next Wednesday. That goes over the first reading assignment as well as the syllabus. So I recommend, reading through it, taking some notes, having those things open, and just working through it on Canvas. And then next week, we'll be building off of the things we've talked about so far to talk about the barriers that impact good listening. What does it mean to be a good listener, and focusing on listening more face-to-face. Again, over the course of the class, we'll be looking at listening in a lot of different situations. We're going to look at it more as like a face-to-face interpersonal area first, but then we'll start talking about things like media, what it means to listen in the context of social and political issues, culture, identity, race, and so on. So this will be a good way for us to start some of these ideas in the first couple of weeks. So listening, right, as I mentioned last class, is not just the process of sounds vibrating in your ears, right? It's not in one ear, out the other, right? When somebody asks, like this class is named, are you listening? That doesn't just mean, are you picking up on that information, right? Sometimes you reach a point when you're reading or you're hearing somebody else talk where all it is like words and you're not putting it together in a meaningful way, your brain kind of shuts down, right? So that's not listening. We can think about listening more as a 5-step process. And so one of the key ways to divide this up, right, is the difference between listening and hearing. Hearing is that physical act, but listening is this longer process where it involves meaning and significance attached to what's being said. But the first step is picking up on information, right? Listening is not just sounds, it's not just audio, it's your other senses as well. You can listen with your eyes, you can pick up on information. You can use things like touch, like tapping somebody on the shoulder, right? So it covers a lot of different senses and is not just about audio, right? If somebody is deaf and is using something like lip reading or ASL, that's listening too. So listening is referring to physically receiving information through our senses, right? Again, it's using your ears, your eyes, your hands, and so on to pick up on information. Listening is reading, such as using Braille. So that's the first part, right? And it gets a little bit trickier from here and gets to something we don't always do. The next step is interpreting, right? Interpreting is where we're initially making sense of and figuring out that information, right? How many folks have taken a communication class before? Several of you, right? So you know that communication, and if this is your first time here, welcome. Glad to have you in a comm class. Communication, right, is the way that we use symbols to convey meaning. So our symbols can be written, they can be spoken, but it's the idea that we as humans understand who we are and are able to share ideas about the world, about ourselves, and so on through communication. So communication could involve something like a stop sign, right? So you physically pick up on the idea that there is this red hexagon with white text on it, right? You receive that information, but you interpret it. You know, okay, I see this here. That means that I need to stop, right? So interpreting is making sense, using your memory banks, your information, a language that you've acquired in society to understand what that message means. You say, there's a stop sign, I need to stop, unless you live in California. Recalling, right, is about how you remember this information for later. So I know a lot of us like use an app with a GPS, like Google Map or something similar, right? You might map out the route and say to yourself, okay, I know how to get here. And then use that to help you as you're driving, right? Recalling is bringing up and committing to memory the route to your destination and doing that later. In the past, before we had like an actual app to use, oftentimes people would use something like MapQuest or a physical map, right? Where they print it out, look at the directions, and then just remember that for later. But again, recalling suggests that if something's important to you, right, you will keep that information for later. And short-term memory is memory that's kind of around an hour or so. For instance, if you're trying to remember which room you need to go to for a class, right, that's probably short-term memory, although you might commit that to long-term memory over time. Long-term memory, right, is stuff that you will continue to remember going forward. We have a lot of options for long-term memory, like we can store a lot of information in our brains, but it takes a long time for us to get to the long-term memory trace, right? Getting people's names down and all that good stuff. So evaluating, right, is the next step. If you complete an evaluation, right, such as an evaluation for a class, you're basically explaining how that class went, how that experience went for you, what went well, what didn't, and so on, right? You're making a judgment about it. In the same way that an evaluation is judging the credibility of a message, right? Whether it's worthwhile and if it's true or not, right? Pictured here on the right is an example from The Onion, right? So The Onion is a satirical news site. Its headlines and information are not real, but they're trying to make fun of and skewer reality, right? There was an Onion headline a few years ago where The Onion said that the US sues upset Netanyahu, leader of, at the time, Israel, with a shipment of ballistic missiles. And there were national leaders and like folks from news journals and so on who thought this was a real story, who actually thought that the United States did that and started sharing the story, right? Not very good evaluation, given that it was a satirical site that this headline came from, right? Evaluation is a major problem we have when we're thinking about credibility of news sources, right? We've seen a lot of fear and discussion about credibility of news, fake news, all of that stuff over the last several years, right? You use social media and you have an older relative, you know that can be a problem sometimes, right? And message credibility and so on. So evaluation is that stage of now that we have a message, what do we think about this message? Do we agree with it? Do we disagree with it, right? Some of you were already doing that evaluation stage when we were talking about the kinds of listeners you were. You were saying, you know what? I am a content-oriented listener. I do like that, but I'm also a time-oriented listener. I want to figure out what to do first and then move from there. These four categories don't quite make sense to me. That's a way that you evaluate the message. One kind of fun way of thinking about the credibility of messages is the 3 hacks of communication, right? Who the heck wrote it? If you're looking at a news source or article for a paper. Who the heck paid for it, right? So there's a lot of published and paid content. So if you see a BuzzFeed article about how top 10 things your dog will love, and it's sponsored by the Purina dog food company, it's going to be biased. And when the heck was it published, right? So generally speaking, more recent is better because it's more responsive to current events. And then lastly, we respond to messages. So I noticed, right, as I was talking to some of you today, you do things such as eye contact, such as nodding, acknowledging, and so on. So we can use both verbal and nonverbal ways to respond to and address the messages that we have. One example, right, is nodding our heads as we agree, shaking our heads if we disagree, and so on. Responding is important because it allows the other person to understand that you're listening to them, that you understand, that you are not just picking up on the information, but that you're doing something. If you have ever had a situation where somebody starts saying, yeah, okay, like in the middle of a sentence before you've even said something yet, that like fake listening is something that we can pick up on a lot too, right? Where we notice that their response does not line up with what we're saying in the order that we're saying. So one way to address and create good listening skills are to avoid situations of like fake or not fully complete listening to. So responding is a big step in that process that helps us to show the other person that we care and that we've picked up on what they have to say. We'll be talking more next week about some of the ways that we respond. A major way we might do that is paraphrasing, right? Or repeating back to the other person what it is that was said. So if that's what listening is, we can think about a lot of different reasons why we choose to listen to other people. So listening fulfills a lot of different goals and can be used for a lot of different reasons. One major way to do that, one major way that we listen, and the reason why we listen is to focus on messages, right? So for instance, if you are driving on the road and you know it's going to be a little bit wild because of the snow and all that stuff, right? You're going to pay attention to the other cars. You're going to figure out who's stopping, who's skidding, and you're going to hopefully be careful about getting where you need to go, given that change. We listen to understand, right? So folks like Prue brought up, being more people-oriented, really liking getting to know other people, right? Presley noted that it lets us feel more naturally connected to other people. We listen to understand people, to get to know them better. We're going on a date, right? We're listening to that person to try to get to know and see if they're a good match for us. We listen to critically evaluate, right? Again, if you check the news headlines, you might think about the role that bias plays, right? So yesterday, the president gave a speech kind of addressing, right, the anniversary of January 6th. I can tell you that the speech and the way it was received looks very different on something like CNN versus Fox News versus BBC, right? That message and how it was responded to looks really different depending on the source. And so critical evaluation recognizes that. We listen to monitor nonverbal signals. So if you're talking and it seems like somebody's drifting away, like they're on their phone, they're rolling their eyes, they don't seem very focused, or like they're paying attention, right? We listen to try to pick up on what's going on. Nonverbal cues play a huge role in our communication. In fact, it can be up to 85% of the amount that we communicate. And studies suggest that we are more likely to see nonverbal communication as more credible than verbal communication. If I were to say, "It's great to see you," right? And I was rolling my eyes and saying it sarcastically, you would interpret that as, "No, you're not," right? The verbal message does not line up with the nonverbal message. You're more likely to believe the nonverbal message. Don't worry, I'm excited to see you. So we also do it to show that we care, right? If we have a close friend or family member that's gone through like a really hard time and just wants to vent and share with us, well, that's really important. And we want to listen, be there to listen, right? To say, "I'm here to listen to you," as a way of showing how much that relationship means to us. We listen to empathize, right? To put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and walk around in them for a while. To quote Atticus Finch from Tillamook, right? And we also listen to create shared understanding. If you're working at a job, right, your supervisor or like your sports coach is trying to create a schedule for you, right? You listen to make sure that you figure out what's going on. You've got the schedule together, you've got a plan. So we listen to make sure we have the information we need to act. Pretty straightforward, but a lot of reasons why listening matters. So in addition to different kinds of listeners, right? There are 4 different types of listening that we can think about too. In just a minute, I'm going to kind of split us up to talk about situations where we might do this style of listening. The first is discriminative listening, right? So discriminative listening means that you are listening usually to pick up on information. So that could be something like, again, you're on the road, you see other cars, you're trying to figure out what the other cars are doing, if they're skidding, and maybe you really swerve away from them if you're worried about them. So it's usually to try to figure out information, right? Or you go outside, you're trying to find your dog, where's your dog? Oh, it's out there in the yard and it's stolen your shoe. Informational listening, right, is something like lecture, right, where you are listening to try to comprehend and understand what's going on. So informational listening maybe means that it's a coach who's giving you a brief about your strategy, or talking about your schedule. Critical listening, right? So if you're familiar with Pinocchio, right, classic, film, story, character, right? The most famous thing about Pinocchio is that, right, whenever he tells a lie, his nose grows. So if you were to talk to Pinocchio and you were to say, hey, are you a real boy? And he was to say, oh yeah, I am, right? And his nose grows, then you would say, no, I'm critically listening to you. I know that when you lie, your nose extends outward. You're not telling the truth. I'm critically listening to this message because what I know about this character is that when he tells a lie, his nose goes out. Then empathetic, right, is listening, something like a therapist or counselor who really is trying to understand and figure out how another person is feeling. Say you're about to do a really big interview and you have a pep talk with a friend. They might use empathetic listening to see how you're feeling. Are you prepared? Are you feeling good? Are you ready to go? So we oftentimes gravitate toward a type of listening ourselves, right? One of the four. But we also do these four different types of listening every single day based on the situation, based on our goals, and some of the things that we hope to gain through that entire process. So what I'd like to do now is I will be dividing you into four small groups, and I'm going to ask each group that'll be tasked with one of these four styles of listening to brainstorm situations in which you would use that listening style, right? So I provided a couple examples. You might use empathetic listening if you're giving a pep talk or you have like a therapist appointment or something like that. I'd like you to think about more. So again, these four are discriminative, informational, critical, and empathetic. So let's have this group of four over here in these tables talk through discriminative listening. Let's have a group of three over here talk about informational listening. Let's have three here talk about critical listening. And let's have three here talk about empathetic listening. And through Zoom, you are welcome to also talk about empathetic listening. So feel free to type in the chat what you have regarding empathetic listening. So again, think about as many situations in which your listening style is used.
When you get hired for a new job.
So it would be like, yeah.
Yeah. To like go to someone. I used this yesterday, actually, I was a fire at the window. And
The same thing
I was
for
driving, I was the drying barrels. And like, tries to have one thing, there's a table water.
Did everything go okay with that fire?
Oh, yes, just fine.
Okay. It's a good example though. No, I wrote.
Yeah.
You also in school class. You gotta make sure you understand the topic.
Like the idea, like open-ended questions like that, like empathetic listening to giving the other person a chance to really talk through, you know, and share their thoughts.
Probably more. Yeah, sure.
So I'll give you all a couple more minutes in each group to continue to brainstorm and think about it. You might also have a representative for each group too. that will share.
Yeah, I know, I'm like, I'm normal.
So go ahead and finish up your current discussion. I know most groups are already about wrapped up. All right, so let's talk through. I'd love to hear some of the examples that each of the 4 groups came up with on types of listening. So let's start here with the discriminative group. What did you all come up with?
We came up with in emergency situations.
Mhm.
So like, if you're on a fire ground and you're like, where's the victim? And you're screaming from the second bedroom, you're like, I'm gonna go with there. In class, avoiding distractions. So it's like focusing on who to listen to versus like people shattering in the back of the class, like a ringtone. Someplace new. Like if you're like traveling or like just going to a new place in general. Sports. We talked about like wrestling, it's like listening, trying to focus on your coach versus the other coach. Driving, like if you hear sirens or a crash, or like you said, the snow, you hear someone drift out. And like in the outdoors, so like you're constantly scanning, like, oh, I heard a coyotes, or I heard a bear, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. This is a really good set of examples here, right? One thing I'm noticing is we use discriminative listening a lot in survival situations, right? Where we're having to scan our surroundings, like we're in the outdoors, right? We really are trying to figure out the like core information that we need. And that kind of connects to Garrett's point, right? About trying to get the lay of the land, the information that we need, and maybe shifting more to a different style, like time-oriented later. So we use discriminative a lot without necessarily thinking about it. We use it in a way that I think will often engage all of our senses. We hear a siren, we see the cars going, we feel like our car like getting like vibrating because we're on a treacherous road or something like that. So it really involves a lot of different approaches. Informational. Let's hear from you all.
So we said like when you get hired for a new job and then listening to like a higher position, you're gonna take in that information. Like a personal trainer as well as that, like you're more likely to know a personal trainer than you are like someone random coming up to you in the gym.
Sure.
Sports, like when your coach is explaining a drill, you want to take that information in so you know like when you're going onto the court of the field. School, obviously, you want to listen to your instructor.
Yeah, thanks, Presley. One interesting thing is we use informational listening a lot, as your group brought up, when we think about like authority and credibility, right? If you have somebody that's like, a coach or, an expert in something, you're going to do more informational listening because you're going to like defer to and listen to them because they have expertise on a topic that you don't. So that can be a major context in which we use that approach. How about critical listening?
So we said that anytime that you're like being taught something or like if you're driving, it's analyzing and evaluating the message so that you're just like you have to do like based off of what you're given. So anytime you're being coached, you have to do that on the field, on the court, when you're running, whatever. And then like driving, I just added into it just because you have to take that information with lanes and not crash. And all
Yeah, a major part, Willie, of like the critical listening approach, right, is thinking through that information. But to take it even further, right, it's figuring out what you're doing with that information. For instance, like say you turn in an essay for a class and your professor gives you feedback on it and says, there's these issues that came up. You might consider how you're integrating that feedback into your next essay or your next assignment. You're not given this like full instruction manual of here's what you do. You're having to consider that. Or for instance, like if you show somebody like you're making music and you show somebody your music and they give you like constructive criticism or feedback, you might say, you have some good points, but also some things that I am not going to change. So it's really kind of filtering out like what information you want to use and integrate, what information you don't want to use, and so on, right? So we might evaluate things like source credibility in that critical listening process too. As far as empathetic listening, we had a comment here in the chat about using that to explain issues with friends, including classes and problems. That's a good approach. What else did you all come up with?
Yeah, so we said it's almost based on feelings and emotions. Probably be the most times you would use empathetic listening, whether that is a best friend helping someone through a breakup, therapist, use open-ended questions to let the speaker tell them about how they feel rather than about you, about the listener.
Yeah, right. I like the point you brought up right at the end, right? Where an empathetic listener, it is not about the listener, right? It's not, one of the challenges of good listening is to avoid making everything about you, right? As a listener, you're really trying to be there for the other person and to understand the challenges that they're dealing with. So I'm glad you all brought that out too. So really good observations here on these different styles of listening and different approaches that we take. So to wrap up for today, we talked through the different types of listeners that we are and people, time, content, and so on. We talked about the process of listening, why we do it, and it being these sort of 5 major steps. And we talked about how, depending on the situation or context, we might use one of those 4 different styles of listening. Really appreciated your brainstorming and observations there. So for next class, we will be getting into a discussion about strategies for being effective listeners. So we'll transition into that area for next week. I know this has been a wild and chaotic week for all of you, but I really appreciate coming to class, participating, being engaged. I really enjoy your thoughts. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Have a great weekend, and I will see you soon.
Hey, Mari.
What are you doing?